I am not Cuban, but I am an economist. I don't know if being married to a Cuban counts. I am married to a Cuban. I have 2 Puerto Rican sons, or daughter and son, and 1 Sarasota daughter, Miami daughter. Yes? And I live in Puerto Rico for 16 years. I am originally from Argentina, but my parents migrated in the late 60s. And I have kind of a clue of why the Puerto Rican representative did not come in.
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, the political representative. Because I wrote a report in 2012, March 24th, 2012, that was called Puerto Rico Failure of the State. And I got in trouble. And those 2 political parties made everything they possibly could do to silence me. And they were successful. And this is the first time after 5 years that I am allowed to talk about Puerto Rico. So I am back in the saddle. I'll talk about, where's my presentation? So, there's a saying that goes from the same bird, 2 wings, so Cuba and Puerto Rico. So I added the broken side, 2 broken wings, because it is very curious to see that both Cuba and Puerto Rico took very different paths, and they are almost very close to the same place today, which is very sad, very sad. Again, I was raised in Puerto Rico, so I know what is happening there, and it's very sad. Actually, we used to have a business until Maria destroyed it. Insurance companies have not paid a penny yet. So that is very, very sad. My home is full because I have my parents that were living in Puerto Rico. Thank God we brought them in before the hurricane. I have a niece. I have my sister-in-law. We're waiting for my brother that is taking care of the business. And we have also a friend living with us because there's nothing happening in Puerto Rico. So what I have done is, I know that you cannot read these, but just kind of a historic, and probably you know all this, how Puerto Rico and Cuba became what they are today. Just inter-American, Spanish-American War. Cuba got its independence. Puerto Rico did not. Became a territory of the U.S. By the mid-1990s, the U.S. government put a development program in place, subsidized industrialization, subsidized taxes on American companies that went to Puerto Rico to open business or manufacturing processes. I used to manage that business back in the 1990s, family business. And at some point in time, one of my suppliers was Bacardi Corporation, correct? And at some point in time, after 2 or 3 years, Bacardi Corporation changed its name to Foods and Spirits. I said, why are you doing that? Well, because the 936 laws are coming to an end, and we are changing our name just to get some more subsidies from the government, correct? So just by changing the name, you could apply for 20 more years of tax exemption. Yeah, so this was something that the Clinton administration took away back in 95. It gave a 10-year period of winding down, and Puerto Rico, after 2006, never recovered. I do not know why. Nobody wants to put the label of depression, because this is where Puerto Rico is today. It is a depressed economy. It has been depressed since 2006. So more or less, this is how they became apart. But you know, Puerto Rico, especially after Maria, has finally collapsed. So let me talk about Puerto Rico first because I do have data. I was scared because I don't have data on Cuba. I have my personal pictures that I took last year when I went to visit. Took my wife for the first time. She left when she was 3 years old. So we came back, or she came back for the first time last year. So I took pictures, and I spoke to people there. Yeah, so I will rely on my pictures and my primary research, which is talking to people on the streets. Yes? On Puerto Rico, actually, I do have data. So here it is. Some infrastructure in Puerto Rico is completely collapsed. It's not as collapsed as the Cuban infrastructure, correct? But it's completely collapsed. And one of the failures of Puerto Rico was to take everything was in public hands, and all the companies, all the public utilities were used for political gains. Never reinvested in infrastructure, and this is why all these companies are. Water and sewers collapse, electricity's collapse, roads are collapsing, and buildings are in the process also. Food, there is no problem other than during the, of course, after the hurricane, there were issues with food, but normally this is a capitalist system, so everything comes in. Employment and wages, the economy is adjusting through quantity. Through quantity. So labor is going down at a very, very fast pace, but prices are not going down. So basically, because prices, we learn in economics that prices are sticky on the downside, all the adjustment is happening through quantity adjustments. And this means that the economy is completely depressed, and it's going to be very, very hard for the economy to move forward. Internet, why do I take that? There's no problem with internet. I mean, there are some issues because of communications after Maria, but other than that, internet is very fast, and everybody has access to it. This is what happened to the economy. This is an indicator by the Government Development Bank. This is a proxy for GDP, and this is what happened after Maria. But you can see that the depression starts in 2006 or so. And of course, this was the Obama help during the recovery from the Great Recession. So this is basically fiscal expenditures brought by the Obama administration that pushed the economy higher during that period. But after that was spent, you can see what happens to the economy already. 12 years in depression, and this was Maria. So very, very difficult situation. I am not very positive about Puerto Rico. You can see that prices, even we had some deflation, but this is what I'm saying. There is no adjustment down in prices. I mean, there has been proposals to lower the minimum wage for young adults that are entering the labor force in order to try to bring down prices, but it is going to be very, very difficult to adjust through prices. So what is happening is that everybody's leaving the island, and that is, the adjustment is happening through quantity adjustment, which is really sad because one of the things that they have is that they do not have a large base of tax receipts, and they are losing their most productive workers. Only the old and needy are staying behind, and that is very, very, very weird. So these are non-farm employment. You can see how bad it is. I just have some sectors. Well, it's great. The unemployment rate has come down, but because people are leaving, correct, and dropping out of the labor force. The labor force participation rate is in the 38%, so almost nobody's working, which is the reason why this number is dropping even as the economy tanks. You can see manufacturing and non-manufacturing employment are doing almost the same. This is the biggest issue. People are just leaving in droves. And this is a serious issue for the US, for Florida, and for the rest of the states where Puerto Ricans are going. I know because I have 6 people in my home. Okay. I have never seen this before. No sector of employment is growing. And of course, this has to do with the hurricane specifically, correct? So everything is growing negatively. This is the worst thing. This, after the 36 were eliminated, Puerto Rico before that had almost 160,000 manufacturing jobs. Today, it's almost 60,000. They have lost almost 100,000 manufacturing jobs in the last 10, 15 years. The curious thing is that output has not dropped. I mean, 50% of Puerto Rican GDP is pharmaceutical products. And they are still 50% and continue to grow. So basically what has happened is that subsidies to employment have been eliminated and companies have technified. So basically they no longer use workers, they only use machines to produce the same output. This is employment in the garment sector. About back then, 1.1 million, total non-farm was 1.1 million. I mean, more than 300,000 used to work for the garment. Today, you can see the adjustment in garment employees, which has been very, very strong. So this is what I was talking about, 1.1 million now. The labor force is basically, I mean, total employment is about 850. So 300,000 jobs have disappeared in the last 15 years. So it's very depressing. Let me talk about Cuba again. These are my personal pictures last year when I went with my wife. But I have some comments on them. So infrastructure, buildings, roads, water, sewer, electricity, food, rice, black beans, pork, lettuce, tomatoes sometimes. Everything is scarce, of course, because the only sector in the economy that gets food, real food, is the tourism sector, and probably the Communist Party members. We stayed at our Airbnb. I did not ask, but they were probably party members, the owners of this Airbnb. So the distribution of the good businesses are going to those who already have resources. We can talk about that. I'm talking about my experience. Yes? Because I don't have data. I told you I do not have data. Just my experience. So exploitation by the state, 2 economies. And exploitation by the state, one of the largest exports from Cuba are doctors and nurses. They are exported to the rest of the world. They probably get paid $120,000, $150,000 per year to the state. And then the state gives them a stipend to these doctors. So this is just a slave economy. Yes, they do have education. They do have good health care. That is true. But what really surprised me and depressed me is that everybody works for the state. And the state takes the money from the companies and pays the worker, which is really, really depressing for somebody that is used to take my money home and do whatever I want, correct? So this is El Vedado. All infrastructure is falling apart. You know, there is no water in Cuba, a very, very little water pressure. You know why? Everybody has water tanks on the tops. You know why? Because if they increase the water pressure, all the pipes will explode. So everybody has, what they do is they buy a tank, they put it on top of their homes, they collect water, and they use it during the day. Because otherwise, there's no water pressure. I always remember in the Dominican Republic, everybody thinks that electricity is not available in the Dominican Republic because there are so many cuts in electricity supply during the day. That is not true. They do have electricity. The problem is that so many people do not pay for electricity that they have to make cuts during the day to reduce the cost of electricity provision, correct? So in Cuba, there is electricity, of course. It goes out almost every day, several times per day, even in the Airbnbs that are in good shape, of course. I mean, this picture is weird. Why would I take that picture? And I took that picture because, I don't know if you noticed, this is an electrical post that has been taken over by the tree. So infrastructure is in really bad shape. You can see the tanks, water tanks, on homes. You know, for what I have asked, there hasn't been almost a road being constructed in Cuba or a home being constructed in Cuba, or at least in Havana and Camagüey, which were the two places that I went, since the revolution triumphed. So if you have a home and you have kids, your kids and their wives and family will come to your home. And so instead of, I mean, this is a massive process by which, I mean, the guy that took us to Camagüey said that they had their 4 kids, were the 4 wives and kids living in their original home, which is weird. But anyway, if you are not used to these type of things, it's just mind-blowing. This is the only way that you can get access to internet. You have to go to a plaza and sit there and pay for government-provided services. My guess is that the state intelligence sector is hard at work to see what they communicate. So it's very weird. You can see that. Every plaza, you can find people. So this is a building that houses people. This is in the Malecon. This is very new because this is used as a hotel, as an Airbnb. You can see that wherever you have this sign is that you can use. So this is private capital that is coming in and using those buildings, the same thing here. This is buildings that are lived in. People live in these buildings. This is Old Havana, just to show you the massive need of infrastructure spending they have. And this is the food. You know, when I went there, they say that now you can see cats, stray cats and dogs in the streets for the first time since the 1990s, because they tend to disappear back then, during the worst parts of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But my biggest concern is that the regular Cubans eat rice, black beans, pork, and when they can access it, tomatoes and some lettuce and coleslaw. And that has consequences for growth and health into the future because they do not have a good diet. So that is my presentation. I can answer questions. This is a very personal view of what Cuba looks like today.
Thanks very much. Our last speaker for this panel is Sara Banias from ExxonMobil. Please join us. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sara Banias. I'm an economist with ExxonMobil. So we've had some presentations that were heavily focused on Cuba and on Puerto Rico, and I'm going to be a bit more of a generalist with you, and then contextualize my remarks around how for Cuba and Puerto Rico and then the rest of the Caribbean. So I'm going to talk about energy and the close tie of energy with the economy, and then what that means for what the world is doing for the next 5 and 20 years around energy, and then what that means for the region, for Cuba and for Puerto Rico. So my company does an outlook every year. I'm actually going to back up one slide just to be technical here. So we do a forward-looking forecast every year, and if you're interested in using the forecast, you should just pay attention to the disclaimer and the role that has for you in using the forecast I'm going to talk to you about. So one of the biggest drivers for energy and how much we use energy would be population in the world. Obviously, the more people we have, the more people want to stay warm, cook their food, use lights, stay comfortable, transport themselves or the goods that they're going to use. So we find when you look for what's going on for energy consumption, either in the Caribbean or in the world writ large, human population is one of the biggest drivers for how much energy we use in the world. And then the second biggest driver would be how those people are living. So you can live at a very low energy budget, as one sees in, for instance, in Cuba, where there's less energy available, it's less expensive, people are living with low energy budget, and how we live here, or how we live in the more wealthier parts of the Caribbean. We're flying in and out, we're bringing in all sorts of goods by both air and sea, and so we're using more energy. So what the economy is doing, how fast the economy is growing, how much manufacturing is going on, even human services being provided, those will all drive how much energy we're using. And so when we look out over the future for the world writ large, we see the economy globally doubling, and that driving a huge amount of incentive for energy consumption. There's a couple other things, but yet in the forecast, actually, we do see a lot of efficiency is possible. So although the economy is going to double and people are growing, we think the amount of energy that's going to grow will be much less than the size of the economy growing. We are achieving a lot of efficiency. We've shown steady improvement in our historical record in how efficiently we use energy. You can even think back to your grandparents' time and how much energy they used to boil a pot of water versus how much you probably use now to boil a pot of water. So we see a lot of efficiency will constrain that energy demand. And I would say that particularly in the Caribbean, there's a lot of opportunity for efficiency. So the energy that's being consumed is actually not as modern and efficient as in some of the most advanced, economically advanced parts of the world. So when you think about efficiency, that's one area where you can see a lot of opportunity for the Caribbean. And often you see economies are able to leapfrog. So when an economy is back behind in GDP size or economic development and income and economy starts growing, often it's possible to leapfrog into the newest technologies and achieve efficiency even faster. And then what I think is actually a relatively good news story given the reality of the population and the desire of the population to grow themselves economically is the story for CO2 emissions, which is, although they're growing in the near term, because of that efficiency and because of some of the fuel changes, there is plenty of opportunity to flatten out and even begin to decline our CO2 emissions on a global basis. And I think that applies on a regional level in the Caribbean as well. And so then this last line is just showing you CO2 intensity, how much CO2 per dollar of GDP. So with that strong growth in the economy globally, how much CO2 being generated has the opportunity, per dollar of GDP has the opportunity to decline. So a couple of just reinforcements now that we just talked about. One would be we see the population growing and we see the economy growing. And so combined within that actually is we see a growing middle class. So if you think that there's about 3 billion people who could be classified middle class in the world today, that will grow to 5 billion people. And so that growing middle class is actually tied to growing higher standards of living. That's higher energy consumption. So there is a lot of pressure from people lifting themselves out of poverty on energy demand. So people that want to have light, that want to have temperature control in their homes, that choose to use, that begin to travel more or use goods on a more global basis, all of that adds pressure to energy consumption. And so we see the global energy needs rise about 25% on a worldwide basis, driven mostly by economies that are less developed, not part of the OECD, and that includes largely parts of the Caribbean. And then electricity demand, which is, as we'll see as we go forward, the biggest driver in energy demand, doubles in the same non-OECD countries. So their energy demand overall is growing 25%, their electricity demand is growing 50%. So that puts a lot of importance and focus on what's going on in the electricity sector in economies as they try to advance economically. And we also see on a global basis, electricity from wind and solar will grow 400%. So huge growth in wind and solar opportunities. These technologies are becoming rapidly more economically competitive in generating electricity. And that too is an area where there's a lot of hope for the Caribbean. I'll show you, it'll take me a couple slides, but we'll get into some energy data from the Caribbean and how much wind and solar is there now. So we also see natural gas expanding greatly as energy consumption is growing. And natural gas, number one, is a great partner to wind and solar energy. So when countries move to adopt more renewable energy, one feature about renewable energy, two features are that it's interruptible. So wind and solar are dependent on the wind and the sun. And so when you want reliable electricity, then it's helpful to have something that can deliver that electricity when the wind and solar is not available. Natural gas is a great partner with wind and solar because it can turn on and off very quickly in response to what's going on the wind and solar side. It helps stabilize electricity grids for a number of different reasons. And then finally, we see oil also playing a very significant role, in part because oil is used not for your electricity, although it is in the Caribbean, but globally and generally and for the long term, oil is still so heavily relied upon for transportation. Airplanes, road transportation, marine transportation, and air transportation are all very heavily reliant on oil, and that's not likely to change in the next 5 to 25 years. So that oil consumption, driven by these expanding economic growth, continues for the foreseeable future. And then I mentioned the carbon opportunities on the previous slide. So this graph helps us illustrate this connection more closely between energy, and this is specifically electricity, and economic opportunity. And so what you see on this up and down or vertical axis is how much electricity is being pursued per person, per capita in economies all over the world, and then what the state of economic income is in those same countries, GDP per capita, on we call it a purchasing power parity basis. It's sort of less relying on exchange rates and more relying on what the value of that dollar is buying. So you see all these countries listed, and of course you see they're kind of forming a line or a band, and that's why we say there's a strong correlation between energy and the state of the economy. And you see on the upper right, more advanced economies like the United States. Over there you see Singapore listed, South Korea. It's fine print, hopefully you can see it. And then as you come into less GDP and less electricity consumption, you see China, India, and this red box is indicating where about half of the world's population sits today. So when you think about people that want to live like we're living now, tomorrow, this is how much energy they're consuming right now. That's how much energy we're consuming now. All these people are moving in that direction. They want to have the same opportunity to travel, the same opportunity to consume a wide variety of goods. So a couple other things about this. I just want to ask a very quick question. Anybody ever listen to TED Talks? Okay, anybody ever listen to the TED Talk about the washing machine? Okay, so just Google, not right now, later on when you're bored, Google TED Talks washing machine, and you'll see one of the best TED Talks it's one of the most highly watched TED Talks. And so it's by a Scandinavian who was a professor, and he started talking about energy in ways that people could relate to. And so he, let's see, I forgot his name. It's Hans Soling, I think. Hans Rolling, I think. But you just have to Google TED Talks washing machine. If you're curious about energy beyond what I tell you today, you'll have a wonderful time, I promise you. One of the things he laughed about was the airline. So if you drew a line across sort of like, between that 5,000 and that 10,000 on the vertical, on this axis, you would have the airline. You'd have the portion of the population that has readily access to air travel versus those that don't. So he brings in some interesting ideas, and I encourage you to take a look at it. In this red box where half the population lives, that's 2,000 kilowatt hours per person. That's the same as one air conditioner cooling one room 24 hours a day. That's how much electricity that is. That is the same as 3 refrigerators running 24 hours a day. That's how much electricity that is. So that's where half the population in the world is living today, and that's the direction they're going. So quickly, just one more slide on the global perspective, and then we'll look at the Caribbean more specifically. But this is now looking at where energy use today is by sector, by portion of the economy, and where it's going, and then by the fuel that's feeding those different sectors. So over here on the far left in the transportation sector, you can see what I say about when all of the transportation is being handled by oil. You can see it here in the statistic very clearly. And then over on the right, you see electricity generation. That's one of the most colorful of the bars. And so you can see how diverse the energy sources are in the electricity sector, the opportunity for different fuels to compete in the electricity sector. And on the top of that, in the light blue, you see the renewables growing. In the red, you see the natural gas growing, and the coal is actually very flat. Move one section in, you see the industrial sector, where you also see fuels competing pretty well to supply all the industrial activity of the world. So you see oil is about a third, natural gas is about a third and growing, and you see coal there. And then in the residential sector, you see a lot of biomass, the brown bar being used, also a lot of natural gas. So you see electricity generation, as I said previously, is the largest part of our energy consumption globally. On the far right, that set of bars is the biggest bars. And then industrial and transportation sector, a little bit more dominant than our home use. So I am an economist, but I have no expertise in Cuba or Puerto Rico. I'm not an expert in the Caribbean. I'm an expert in energy. I'm probably more Asia-focused than anything. And I went into this after talking with David a little bit more confident about how much data I would find and be able to use. And there's really surprisingly a very restricted amount of data available to describe individual countries across the Caribbean in detail about their energy use. So this is World Bank data, and it's from 2015. I know that 2016 is available, but it's really more about the story and the relative levels, so I didn't worry about getting you the most recent year. And so if you look over on the left-hand side, you see oil, and you see this dramatic difference, say, even between Cuba and Haiti, and you see Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico kind of similar, how much oil they're using per day. One of the things that distinguishes the Caribbean from the rest of the world is how much oil is used more broadly across the economy. So we were just talking about how much oil is heavily used for the transportation sector. In the Caribbean, it is heavily used for electricity generation. It is liquid, it's fungible, it comes in, it can be stored. After Puerto Rico, everybody was firing their emergency generators. That's how they were getting electricity. So that's one of the distinguishing factors in the Caribbean. You can see on the far right, here's where renewables are playing out in the region today. Cuba, I have to say, surprised me for how much non-hydro wind and solar is in Cuba. And Jamaica, so you can see, relatively many of the parts of the Caribbean, much less in terms of wind and solar, a lot of opportunity there. And then also you see natural gas, relative to all that oil being consumed, much less. So if you were going to ramp up renewables, you'd have an opportunity also to ramp up natural gas. It would be cleaner burning than using oil in the electricity sector. So there's a lot of opportunity there as well. So this just shows you oil on a global basis, and I'll just point out one thing here and then we'll move on. The middle bar, the light green, the second one up from the top, that's commercial transportation. And then the bottom part, the darker green, that's what we say light duty. That would be more like individuals driving their vehicles. So what we see in economies that are growing is that there's lots of opportunity for efficiency in individual vehicles, and there's lots of energy consumption that's expected as economies grow around commercial transportation. So that's one of the big drivers on that oil demand, is how commercial transportation plays such a big role. Let's see here. And then just briefly a little bit more about the electricity sector. What you see here are per household numbers for both residential electricity use and then the different energies that are being used in the households at the residential level. And so on all of these cases, you don't see things going up as much as you did in my earlier slides, because this is per household. So what we're expecting is number of households grow. But when you look at these per household numbers, you see the opportunities for efficiency in economies. And this would be very much true in the Caribbean. So you see, for instance, on the right-hand side, Africa and Asia Pacific, these large brown sectors are biomass use. So when you take out that biomass use and you put in other energy sources, you achieve a great deal of efficiency and a great deal of carbon emission efficiency gains as well. So that's an important area of opportunity. And the same happens on a lesser scale when you replace some of the oil use for other forms of electricity generation. So I just want to talk briefly about what can happen as economies switch to other forms of energy and seek to reduce their carbon emissions. And I want to do that from the perspective of a comparison between the United States and Germany. So in Germany, and this is already this picture is changing. This data ends in 2015 and we're a few years on now. But when Germany first set out to lower its carbon emissions and institute new energy policies, they did two things. They really wanted to promote wind and solar and renewables, so that's where you see that light green section expanding in the middle. And they wanted to phase out nuclear energy, so that's where you see the blue bar shrinking very rapidly. The United States, on the other hand, had started producing more and more oil and natural gas domestically and was very kind of more focused on the emissions from coal. So we have a lot of new regulations in the US which impact coal generation. So that's why you see it's harder and harder for coal to compete in the United States in generating electricity, and natural gas is expanding very rapidly. And so when I talk about natural gas being this great partner for achieving emissions reductions and delivering electricity in a broad way across an economy, the reason I talk about that is because when you look at the impact of these two different approaches, the US and Germany, and what happened to carbon emissions, actually you see during that period that the carbon emissions in the United States actually dropped farther than in Germany. So Germany was much more aggressive with wind and solar, but the United States was using more natural gas. And you can also achieve a great deal of environmental benefit from going that direction. just very, very quickly, I'm going to talk about the hurricanes and how oil and gas and electricity markets respond and interact in the hurricane situations that are so prevalent in the region of the Caribbean. And so one of the first things is that where you have a lot of market forces, as we've seen in the United States and in Florida's experiences, and you allow those market forces to work, they can be a great mechanism for allowing an economy to respond and recover in a hurricane-type environment. So, and particularly this occurs where you have a really good functioning market, which we do in the oil market. So oil is traded and produced heavily all over the world, and across the United States with lots of different players, lots of different buyers and sellers. So what happens is that in Florida, over the period of 10 or 20 years and looking at several hurricanes, the inability to get the fuel into the state is what's driving up the price. But that increase in price is what's attracting all kinds of oil and gas back into the state in response. Often what happens in the oil industry when the hurricanes hit is that the industry needs a little bit of wiggle room. There's lots of environmental regulations that create little tiny micro markets. And we have to make the right gasoline for this part of Florida and the right gasoline for that part of Florida. So we get those rules loosened up, and then the oil flows in very readily into the area and helps the recovery. Actually, we saw that in Puerto Rico too. So the industry is actually quite motivated. Being a reliable supplier into the marketplace is an important thing for the industry. So in the immediate aftermath of Maria, the oil companies were actually working on how to get the oil into the state. It's their interest. They want that to be a reliable source of energy. So actually, it's not that oil was not available in Puerto Rico. The biggest challenge for Puerto Rico on both the oil side and electricity side was the transportation networks, right? So all the transmission infrastructure for electricity and all the road infrastructure that the oil distribution needed to rely on, and that was the biggest factor. So like I was trying to describe, there's a lot of rerouting of tankers and trucks in response to this kind of event. One of the things that's worked out well is that there's a lot of close coordination between the energy sector and the government. So it's a vital part of the economy, and the government knows it, and we have a lot of coordinating bodies that work on this. They also exist in Puerto Rico, they also exist in other parts of the Caribbean. But one sort of little example I have is how when the last hurricane came and flooded Texas and Louisiana so heavily, and particularly Texas, often the energy companies will reach out to the government and work with the government proactively to respond. So in that instance, in that particular case, the refineries in the area were able to help the city restore the water supply to the city of Beaumont by providing pipe and by providing a workaround network to areas that were flooded. And then finally, just the way refineries and the oil supply environment responds to these kinds of events is with a lot of preparation and preparedness. So after Katrina and Rita, there was a lot of review in the industry about how to change practices to make it work better. Same thing has happened this fall. There were about 3 conferences in the last month, all with the oil industry looking at how it could respond better. But already from a previous time, there's a lot of pre-positioning of things now in the industry. So often emergency response supplies are pre-positioned. In the case of keeping refineries operating, more crews live on the refinery during a hurricane event in order to provide rapid response. So I just thought I'd touch on that kind of response that occurs. And then everything I've shown you is available online. You can find it there. And that's the website for finding that same information.
So if panelists will just join me up here. We have about 5 minutes for Q&A, and we just need to get the microphones circulating. You want to take it over there first, please? And then we'll come over here. And if it's a question for a specific speaker, if you'll just indicate that, that'd be great.
Well, everybody's getting situated. What a great morning presentation. It's so exciting to hear this. I just want to say that I've traveled throughout the entire island by car, and I was most recently there a week ago in Cuba. And I want to clarify just for the state of the audience, because I feel it's really important for clarification on the presentation about the infrastructure. I think we need to give a note of thanks, and I think it's on the program later, that Cuba saved us when Irma hit and scraped along the north coast of Cuba. They took a direct hit of Irma, broke it up, so us sitting right here, and what's, we're fine now. So with regards to infrastructure, I think we should remember that if we're going to talk about the history of the islands, it started with a slave economy that put them far ahead. They were trading centers, and those structures have held for a long time. And with the burgeoning middle class and the hope that was coming with the opening, people were painting, buildings are being constructed. So there's active construction going on. I want to clarify that. There is food. It's seasonal. The food is organic and seasonal, so if you're in the summer, the dry seasons, you're not going to see as much in the markets, but the fresh markets are where a lot of economy is taking place. And I think there's a lot we can learn from how they have maximized their nutritional capabilities, and the people are really healthy in Cuba. You don't see the level of obesity, et cetera. So my question is, in what way can we interface those who want to go and continue to help support the Cuban people? That's one of the initiatives, because they're in the middle of all this other political stuff going on. And so I think they're very interested in partnering on architectural ideas and redesign. I've seen that happening where they have retrofitted. With regards to the water, they release the water every night into the tanks. There is water there. It's just a matter of not overutilizing it like here. We can learn from that. Solar and I think those aspects are also a great opportunity that I'd like to see more of. How can we maximize that under the limitations that we're functioning from now?
So I think the question is, are there opportunities to enhance collaboration given the restrictions? Does anybody want to?
Well, I think so. I mean, again, my experience was my experience. We have our youngest daughter did a semester at the University of Havana, so that's why we were there. She has gone back 3 times already, so she's in love with that, her mom's island. And so, but the issues are serious. I mean, infrastructure. I mean, if Cuba wants to get out, it needs. I mean, if Puerto Rico needs, somebody said $90 billion to start all over again. Cuba is how many times? 20 times Puerto Rico. It might need 20 times $90 billion to start. So the government has to, I mean, the political system has to change for capital to come in. Uncertainty is not good for anything of this. So, but yes, I mean, I think that the potential is there.
Yeah, just quickly, I think there are opportunities, but it's going to be more challenging to take advantage of them. So for instance, last 3 months, 24 universities have canceled their educational exchange agreement with Cuba. And of course, it's now going to be more and more difficult to get visas. In the last year, a lot of people just went directly by themselves. Now you're going to have to go to groups, educational institutions, religious institutions, travel agencies, cruise ships, and I think we should expect to see a decline in the number of U.S. citizens traveling to Cuba.
Okay. Unfortunately, only time for one more question. We're going to go right up here in the second row.
Good morning and thank you. The presentation was wonderful, but in certain matter, I have to disagree with Eugenio Aleman. I am Elizabeth Cuevas Nunder. I am the founder CEO for the Puerto Rican Chamber of Commerce of Florida. Also, I am the only woman in the United States of America, Puerto Rican, who has run for governor. So I just want to let you know, I visited my island last month. We are in a mission of giving to our small farmers in Puerto Rico seeds and funding to rejuvenate their small farms, which are the economy of Puerto Rico. There's 2 economies in Puerto Rico, Ms. Eugenio. There is the visual economy, and there is the underground economy. The underground economy in Puerto Rico is huge. You go to any hotels or any restaurants, the malls, and they're packed. Everything is cash. So that's one thing. The other thing is just mention that Puerto Rico's government, there are 2 parties which both are socialist. So we have a little difference between Cuba and Puerto Rico, which is Cuba's a country that is being dominated by communism, and Puerto Rico for the past 30 years, socialism. And the other thing I wanted to ask is why invest in Cuba when Puerto Rico is part of the United States? We have been giving more men and women to our armed forces than any other state in the Union in comparison with size. And we have some of the most fertile and most beautiful soils in the planet. Come over to Puerto Rico because we are doing business.
Make that
Not sure there was
make
a-
that question the last question to the panel. Why invest? Where to invest?
So the
Cuba.
question is, why invest in Cuba versus Puerto Rico or Puerto Rico versus Cuba? Does anyone care to address that?
I mean, there's money for everything. I'm not arguing for one or the other. I wish they all go to Puerto Rico because our business will recover. If that is my personal taste. But I think that both islands are in deep trouble if they don't change their ways. They will not be able to recover.
Jorge, sir.
I think when President Obama initiated the rapprochement, there was a tremendous response by the business community, not only the U.S. but all over the world, because of the size of the Cuban economy, the market opportunities there. Unfortunately, 2 years into the opening, those opportunities have not materialized, except in a very few specific sectors like transportation, like communications, and so on. But actually, I think the business community is now looking outside of Cuba because Cuba seems to be still a very difficult place to invest in, and why not Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico is open for business.
So just to jump in with the generalist perspective, with no allegiance anywhere in the region, investors look for returns. That's what investors look. They look for the return they're going to get for the money they place, and that can be a tricky thing. I mean, sometimes you could easily find some opportunities to generate a return in a Cuba, and you can find opportunities to generate a return in a Puerto Rico. It is often incumbent on the country that is seeking international investors to demonstrate the return that is possible. And that is a big challenge, I think, in the region, is being able to accurately and competitively communicate the opportunity that is there for investors.
Thank you. Let's have a round of applause for our great panelists.
We have had a wonderful morning. We're going to take a break. Let me just make a couple of announcements. The slides will be available on the Global Interdependence Center website. And Jill Fernito, is that correct? Can't hear a word. With permission from the speakers, and we won't let them out of the room unless they give us one. And I want to say just two quick things. I have a colleague here, Patty Healy. Patty, stand up so everybody sees you. Patty is the director of research in our firm and specializes in municipal research and has done detailed work on the bond insurers who have insured Puerto Rico debt and the status of Puerto Rico debt, which is her expertise. So I would suggest you corner her during the coffee break. And lastly, on April 5th, we are now going to have a session on Puerto Rico, on bond insurers, and we now have a commitment from Assured Guarantee, the largest insurer in the United States of municipal debt, as well as others to discuss Puerto Rico finance, Puerto Rico debt, and that is now scheduled on April 5th. So that is my housekeeping. We will break for 12 minutes and resume with the session on business. One last thing on the coffee break, since we didn't get to it. Ask the speakers about the Jones Act and shipping and where it applies to the Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere.